Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced a partial mobilization. This is today, a move that will see 300,000 Russian citizens in the military reserves called up to serve in Ukraine. The development marked a significant escalation of Russia's war on Ukraine and just came a day after a series of coordinated moves towards annexation referendums in Russian-occupied Ukrainian areas. Now, he accused the West of wanting to see Russia weakened and said a threat to retaliate further was not a bluff. Mr. Putin effectively announced plans to annex 4 Ukrainian regions, saying Moscow would facilitate regions in joining Russia referendums in Ukraine's Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. A day earlier, Russian-installed officials in the 4 regions announced plans for such votes, which Western countries denounced as shams. Meanwhile, flights out of Russia quickly sold out following the announcement of Russia's first military mobilization since World War II, a dramatic reversal after months in which Moscow had insisted its operation was going to plan. And speaking shortly after Mr. Putin, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that Russia would draft that number, 300,000 additional personnel out of some 25 million potential fighters at Moscow's disposal. The mobilization, the first since the Soviet Union, begins immediately. In Moscow's first update on casualty numbers in almost 6 months, Minister Shoigu said 5,937 Russian soldiers had been killed since the start of the conflict. President Putin had ordered Russia's mobilization since World War II in his earlier address today. And world leaders have been reacting to Putin's partial mobilization announcement. A few moments ago, U.S. President Joe Biden delivered a harsh rebuke to Russian President in a speech at the United Nations, saying Russia's invasion of Ukraine shamelessly violates the UN Charter and declaring atrocities in Ukraine, he said, should make your blood run cold. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that he did not believe the world would allow Vladimir Putin to use nuclear weapons and pledged to press on with liberating Ukrainian territory captured by Russian forces. Zelensky was speaking to Germany's Bild television in an interview published hours after Russia's president's announcement. And NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that Putin's military mobilization is a dangerous and reckless nuclear rhetoric. He also warned that more troops will escalate the conflict in Ukraine. For the British Foreign Office Minister Gillian Keegan, he says clearly it's something that we should take very seriously because, you know, we are not in control. I'm not sure he is in control either, really. This is obviously an escalation. Germany's vice-chancellor called it another bad and wrong step from Russia, which, of course, he says will be discussed and consulted on politically regarding how to respond. He says Russian sham referendums in Ukraine will never be recognized. Foreign policy spokesman for the European Union, Peter Stano, said it's just another proof that Putin is not interested in peace and that he is interested in escalating the war of aggression. He says this is yet another sign of his desperation. China also reacted to this, but the Foreign Ministry urged all parties to engage in dialogue and consultation and find a way to address the security concerns of all parties. Romania reacted thus, saying today is International Peace Day, and instead of celebrating it properly, unfortunately, he said this morning we took note with concern of President Putin's statement regarding the mobilization and the so-called referenda. For Lithuania, since Russia's military mobilization will also be carried out in Kaliningrad region in our neighborhood, Lithuania cannot just watch. We also heard from Russian critic Alexei Navalny, who says this will result in a massive tragedy. UA's Anna Jennikova joins us now for the latest. Anna, so good to see you. Talk to us. I mean, how people in Ukraine, Kyiv where you are reacting to this televised address by Russia's president.
Yeah, hello, good evening. Well, I should say that it was not a complete surprise for Ukrainian society and Ukrainian officials. You know, this partial mobilization, information about the partial mobilization was in the air. And as President Zelensky mentioned, Ukrainian intelligence reported at least during the last months, there were reports that this hidden mobilization is taking place. So basically, President Zelensky said that this is not a news for him, and this is not a surprise, and this is something that also, as I already said, was expected, quite expected. Ukrainian society, well, Ukrainian soldiers, interesting reaction from them. They said that they don't care how many people will be on that side. They will continue to defend their land. And similar reaction is coming from Ukrainian military officials. Also, President Zelensky made his comments on President Putin's nuclear comments, and President Zelensky said that he did not believe that President Putin would use nuclear weapons, but of course we never know what this man, talking about President of Russian Federation, has in mind, said Zelensky. So this is a kind of a reaction. Again, also President Zelensky later on during the day, basically just a couple of minutes ago, he also made another remark that Ukraine will continue to do its task to protecting its land, its country, and defending itself. So we should not listen to what's happening in other countries, like in the country of that is following the impression and that came to war to us. But we just have to follow our own route and do what we have to do to defend our land.
And also, Anna, I mean, Moscow-backed separatists in Ukraine are calling for a referendum. Will this happen? Will this pave way for the former Russian annexation? What are you hearing?
So these reports are coming for a couple of months now in these areas which are under temporary occupation. Local Ukrainian Ukrainian authorities in these areas who are still present. I mean, they're not obviously on the territories, but they are still existing. So they are saying that this. So basically, they will do everything possible to not make it happen. And also, Ukraine in this territory there is a very strong partisan movement, which is making it much more difficult for Russian forces to get ready to this referendum. But again, as Ukrainian authorities and President Zelensky himself already mentioned before, that these referendums would never be recognized, of course, by Ukraine. And if this happens, President Zelensky said it a couple of times already, this would end any possibility for any further negotiations with Russia. So, I mean, the position of Ukrainian side doesn't really change. Maybe, apparently, we will hear some more details from President Zelensky later on in his evening speech. But for the moment, situation is the following. So this referendum would never be recognized by Ukrainian side, and this would basically, again, according to the president, this would end any possibility for negotiations with Russia.
I know you said that this is a temporary hold of the Russians, and that's where this is taking place with the Moscow-backed separatists. But if we were to ask, how much territory could Ukraine lose if this were to go ahead?
Well, it's quite a lot. So here we are talking about a huge part of Luhansk region. So Luhansk region for the moment is almost completely under occupation. Some settlements and villages are liberated already by Ukrainian forces, and Ukrainian forces are advancing in that areas as well. But at the moment, very heavy fightings are happening, so we cannot talk about complete liberation. I mean, complete like advance, yeah. But fightings are happening. So we talk about a huge amount of Luhansk region, some part of Donetsk region. Also, there is Kherson region, which is mostly on the other side of the Dnieper River, and part of the Zaporizhzhia region. So it's quite a lot. And what is important to understand that having this, Kherson region under control, Russia provides Crimea with important connection to land and water supply and so on and so forth. So, of course, this is something that definitely cannot just be watched. It should be a reaction. And actually, President Zelensky also asked international community and Ukrainian and all the international partners in Ukraine to go on with more sanctions because of this announcement by President Putin.
And finally, before we let you go, Anna, I mean, it's quite interesting to note yesterday, Turkey's president was talking about a significant step that will be made, seemingly suggesting Russia's president was willing to end the war. And then this morning, we hear from the president mobilizing. I mean, one wonders, what is happening. Is it that the Turkish president perhaps was, there was just a lot of hope for him, and then Russia's president went and did, something else. I mean, what do you make of, what we're hearing, what is playing out?
He actually said something similar to also Prime Minister of India during their latest meeting. It looks like, in general, President Putin probably wants to end the war, but he wants to end this war under his conditions and under his, plan. And this is something that's not going to happen if we look at the Ukrainian perspective. So apparently, President Putin was, trying to give certain hints that he is ready to negotiate, but again, at the same time, he's saying that peace is only possible under Russian rules. So I don't think that we all should, think of what President Putin said in terms of his willingness for peace. We should not think about, peace which would be good for Ukraine. So President Putin, as he already mentioned a lot of times, he wants the full control of Ukraine because, he wants to liberate, as he put it, Ukrainian people from Nazism and so on and so forth. So he wants the full control, and Ukrainian people do not want to give their land, and they will defend their land and their people. They do not need any liberation, any, help from Russia. This is for sure. So the only peace President Putin for the moment is 24. At least this is how it looks from his, latest comments and latest actions, especially, is peace under his rules. And this is something that Ukraine would never accept, because for Ukraine it would mean just the end of its existence. So this is kind of, very tricky. I think very tricky thing to analyze, because President Putin has something special in his mind, and this is definitely something that which would only mean his point of view and his goals.
Anna Jennikova, live from Kyiv, VOA's Anna Jennikova. Thank you. Always a pleasure. Continue to stay safe.
Thank you.
More stories now coming in from Ukraine. The McDonald's eateries in Kyiv has reopened, a symbol of the war-torn country's return to some sense of normalcy and a show of support after the American fast food chain pulled out of Russia. The burger giant closed its Ukrainian restaurants after Russia's invasion nearly 7 months ago, but has continued to pay more than 10,000 McDonald's employees in the country. The 3 restaurants that have reopened in the capital are offering a delivery service only, but there was no shortage of customers on Tuesday, that's yesterday, as delivery drivers streamed in and out collecting orders. Staying with global food security, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken joined world leaders in highlighting Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a contributing factor to high rates of global food crisis. Speaking at the Global Food Security Summit, he painted a picture of an already grim food security landscape when Russia launched its war in Ukraine.
Thank you.
At the outset of 2022, conflicts, COVID-19, the effects of the climate crisis had already driven more than 190 million people into acute food insecurity. According to the World Food Program, President Putin's brutal war of aggression in Ukraine may add 70 million people on top of that, an already staggering number becoming even more staggering. That agreement should never have been necessary in the first place. The only reason it was is because Russia, having invaded Ukraine, was then blockading its ports and preventing food that had been feeding the world from getting out. But we had to deal with the reality before us, and the deal that was brokered by the United Nations with Turkey's assistance actually enabled the grain to start moving again.
Russia must end its illegal war against Ukraine, which has threatened an essential source of the world's food supply. The truth is that Putin is trying to blackmail the international community with a large part of the world's food needs.
The U.S. Secretary of State also spoke on how the U.S. will never recognize Russia's plans to hold referenda in parts of Ukraine.
For the United Nations, for the General Assembly, for the United Nations Charter, the very principles that we're here to uphold this week in the Charter, sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, are what are being violently aggressed by Russia, including through the attempts to proceed with these referenda and putting even more forces into the effort to seize Ukrainian sovereign territory. I think it's also not a surprise that this is happening now. We've seen in the last weeks significant gains by Ukraine in taking back the land, its land, seized by Russian forces since the aggression began February 24th. It's also a time when Russia itself is seeing serious reverses on the battlefield, and even some of its closest partners are clearly raising their deep concerns about what Russia is doing and the consequences this is having for countries around the world. And I'd also say, none of this, the sham referenda, the potential mobilization of additional forces, is a sign of strength. On the contrary, it's a sign of weakness. It's the sign of Russian failure. Let me be very clear. If these referenda proceed, and if Russia purports to annex Ukrainian territory, the United States will never, never recognize it.
Coming up on the program. We have more on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, plus the UN General Assembly as UN chief calls for solidarity to tackle global challenges. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Staying with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it is taking center stage at the United Nations General Assembly. Other leaders have condemned what they call Putin's imperialism, calling for immediate talks. Romania's president said there was no justification for bloodshed, destruction, and human suffering.
President Putin's brutal war of aggression.
There is no justification for a military aggression against a sovereign state. There is no justification for bloodshed, destruction, and human suffering. It is our joint responsibility to come together and uphold our common values as members of the United Nations. Democracy and universal human rights are legitimate aspirations for all humankind. We therefore need to act now and support all those who fight for freedom and democracy. Since the beginning of the conflict, over 2.3 million Ukrainians have crossed our borders. Romania has offered not only emergency assistance, but also medium and long-term support for those who decided to stay in our country with free access to education, health services, and the labor market. In addition, we offered direct humanitarian assistance and put in place a logistic hub for coordinating the international humanitarian assistance from the entire world. Weaponizing access to food and restricting it around the world are unacceptable. In order to support the Ukrainian economy and help manage the global food crisis, Romania has acted in a responsible way by facilitating the export of more than 4 million tons of Ukrainian grain, which represents 60% of the grain exported by Ukraine through our ports on the Danube and at the Black Sea since the beginning of the crisis.
On behalf of the Assembly,
Well, staying with the Assembly, France President Emmanuel Macron warned that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was dividing the world and restoring the age of imperialism and colonies. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz urged UN member states not to concede to Russia in peace negotiations. Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi denounced Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but he believes it was imperative to find a lasting solution for peace. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine as destabilizing the international order to its core, insisting that the rule of law, not coercion by power, should prevail. For Poland, while the conflict has garnered much attention since it began earlier this year, it is naturally of special significance to Poland, which shares a border with Ukraine. Polish President Andrzej Duda embraced the righteousness of the Ukrainian cause.
Byliśmy w czasie